History often leaves behind fragments that don't fit the official narrative, quiet anomalies buried in the dust of decommissioned archives. There are coordinates in the subarctic that shouldn't exist, and signals that were never meant to be heard by anyone outside of a specific, long-forgotten chain of command. The following account is reconstructed from the logs of a scouting party that found a place that, by all accounts, was never there. The transition from the 1970s into the late 1980s brought a strange tension to the northern radio bands, a period when the airwaves were crowded with the hum of a dying era. In the remote wilderness of the 38th parallel, the silence was usually only broken by the static of solar flares or the occasional long-range military broadcast. However, in the autumn of 1987, a new sound began to permeate the secure frequencies used by the weather monitoring stations. It was a rhythmic, mechanical ticking, steady and indifferent to the chaotic shifts in atmospheric pressure. It didn't carry the signature of a standard clock or a metronome, but something heavier, like the gears of a massive industrial timer echoing through a hollow space. Technicians at the nearest outpost, 300 miles to the south, began to log the sound every night at exactly 2:00 hours. By the second week, the ticking was joined by another sound, the low, labored cadence of human breathing. It was heavy and wet, the sound of someone sitting very close to a microphone in a cold room. There were no words, no calls for help, no identifiers, just the steady inhalation and exhalation of a person who seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Captain Elias Thorne was tasked with leading a small 4-man scouting party to triangulate the source of these unauthorized transmissions. They moved through the subarctic taiga on tracked vehicles, their headlights cutting through a perpetual clinging fog that seemed to swallow the sound of their engines. The maps provided by the Ministry of Defense showed nothing but topographical lines and empty tundra for hundreds of square miles. The deeper they moved into the restricted zone, the more the equipment began to drift. Compass needles vibrated with a subtle, nervous energy, and the radio static grew dense and textured, like the sound of rushing water. Thorne noted in his field journal that the landscape felt curated, the trees thinning out in a way that suggested a deliberate clearing made decades ago. On the third morning, the fog lifted just enough to reveal a structure perched on a rocky outcrop. It was a low-slung, reinforced concrete observation post, painted in a faded olive drab that blended perfectly with the gray lichen of the rocks. There were no antennas visible, yet the signal strength on their handheld receivers was now pinning the needles into the red. The scouting party approached on foot, their boots crunching on a layer of frost that had settled over a neatly graveled path. There was no perimeter fence, no signs of life, and no tracks leading to or from the heavy steel door. Despite the sub-zero temperatures, a thin plume of white steam rose from a vent on the roof, indicating that a heating system was active deep inside. Thorne reached out to the heavy iron handle, expecting it to be locked or rusted shut by years of neglect. Instead, the mechanism turned with a smooth, oiled silence that felt unnervingly modern. The door swung inward, revealing a short, dimly lit corridor that smelled of ozone and old paper. At the end of the hall, a single yellow light flickered behind a frosted glass window. The interior of the station was a sharp contrast to the brutalist exterior, appearing more like a well-kept study than a military outpost. Polished wood desks held neat stacks of weather charts, and a large brass clock hung on the wall, its pendulum swinging with the exact rhythm they had heard over the radio. A small coal stove in the corner radiated a gentle, steady heat that filled the room. On the central table sat a ceramic teapot, still emitting a faint wisp of steam, accompanied by 2 half-filled cups of dark tea. The liquid was still warm to the touch, and a plate of biscuits sat nearby, untouched and fresh. There were no coats on the pegs, no boots by the door, and the dust on the floor was undisturbed, showing only the fresh tracks of Thorne's team. One of the men pointed to a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting on the primary console, its wheels spinning slowly. A green light indicated it was in broadcast mode, sending the live ambient sound of the room out into the atmosphere. They stood in total silence, listening to the ticking clock, realizing that their own breathing was now being transmitted across the secure military frequency. Thorn moved to the main logbook, which lay open next to a fountain pen that had leaked a small, dark circle onto the page. Every entry in the book had been systematically destroyed, the paper eaten away by a precise application of caustic acid. Only the very last line on the final page remained legible, written in a cramped, hurried hand. The orientation is corrected. The team searched the small facility, finding a sleeping quarter with 2 beds that were neatly made, the blankets pulled tight with military precision. Beneath the pillows, they found nothing. No personal letters, no identification, and no photographs. It was as if the occupants had been scrubbed from existence, leaving behind only the domestic habits of a life they were no longer living. In the small kitchenette, the supplies were stocked with an eerie level of foresight. Rows of canned goods and dry rations filled the cupboards, all bearing labels from a domestic distributor that had gone out of business in 1974. The expiration dates were all current, suggesting the food had been produced and delivered long after the factory had been demolished. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the tundra, Thorn stepped back outside to survey the perimeter one last time. He walked a full circle around the concrete structure, his eyes fixed on the pristine, undisturbed snow that surrounded the outcrop. There were no footprints other than their own, and no sign that anyone had entered or exited the station in years. The realization settled over the group with a cold, heavy weight. The tea was hot, the stove was fed, and the logs were fresh. Yet the land itself claimed no one had been there. They stood in a kind of quiet suspension, a small corner of the world being tended by an unseen hand. Thorn told his men to set up a watch, their lanterns casting dim, nervous light against the waiting dark. The first night at the station was defined by a silence so absolute it felt physical, pressing against the eardrums like deep water. Thorn's men sat in the main operations room, their eyes darting between the rhythmic pendulum of the brass clock and the spinning reels of the tape recorder. Every few hours, the heavy, wet sound of breathing would return to the monitor, but now it was layered with the faint, metallic echo of their own hushed whispers. The team took turns patrolling the narrow corridor, their flashlights illuminating the frosted glass and the strange acidic scent that lingered near the redacted logbooks. Despite the warmth of the coal stove, a persistent chill seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the concrete were a heat sink for the surrounding permafrost. They spoke only when necessary, their voices sounding thin and alien in the meticulously preserved room. Private Miller, the team's communications specialist, spent the early hours of the morning attempting to trace the power source for the facility. He followed the heavy conduits under the floorboards, but they terminated abruptly into the solid bedrock beneath the foundation. There were no generators, no external fuel tanks, and no power lines stretching out into the dark, yet the lights remained steady, and the air remained warm. By dawn, the fog had returned, thicker and more opaque than the day before, settling itself like a gray veil that pressed quietly against the thick window panes. Thorn stood by the kitchenette, his posture still, his eyes tracing the familiar shapes as he examined the canned goods again. His fingers moved gently over the labels of the defunct 1970s distributor, as though feeling for a story hidden beneath the fading ink. He opened a tin of peaches, the soft metal giving way with a muted sigh, and inside he found the fruit perfectly preserved, tasting exactly as it should, despite the impossibility of its origin. Searching for a basement or a crawl space, the men discovered a heavy steel hatch concealed beneath a rug in the sleeping quarters. It was bolted from the inside with a series of reinforced sliding bars, suggesting that whatever the occupants feared, it was not outside in the cold, but within the station itself. It took the combined effort of 3 men to heave the bolts back, the metal screaming with a lack of lubrication. Beneath the hatch lay a narrow, vertical shaft with a rusted iron ladder descending into a darkness that their flashlights could not fully penetrate. The air rising from the hole was dry and smelled of old electricity and scorched copper, a stark contrast to the ozone of the floors above. Thorn descended first, his boots ringing against the rungs, until he reached a small circular chamber 30 feet below the surface. The chamber was filled with rows of analytical equipment that appeared decades ahead of the technology available in 1987. Smooth, glass-faced monitors displayed scrolling lines of green light, tracing the subterranean shifts of the tectonic plates along the 38th parallel. There were no keyboards or switches, only a series of recessed, touch-sensitive panels that glowed with a soft, pulsing amber. In the center of the room sat a single chair, facing a wall of mirrors, angled in a way that created an infinite, receding tunnel of reflections. On the armrest of the chair, Thorn found a pair of headphones connected to a terminal that was labeled only with a series of geographic coordinates. When he put them on, he didn't hear the ticking or the breathing, but the sound of a distant, howling wind that seemed to originate from nowhere. The rest of the team joined him in the cramped space, their shadows drifting softly across the mirrors as they moved through the silent machinery. They found a series of storage lockers containing neatly folded uniforms, all of them devoid of rank, names, or national insignia. The fabric was a heavy, slate-gray wool, carrying the faint scent of cedar and a chemical they couldn't identify. One of the monitors began to beep, a low, melodic tone that repeated every 5 seconds, synchronized with the ticking of the clock upstairs. A new line of text appeared on the screen, rendered in the same cramped, hurried handwriting they had seen in the logbook. The pressure is equalized. The men watched as the green lines on the screens stabilized into a perfectly flat, unbroken horizon. The tension among the group began to fray as they realized they were not just in a hidden outpost, but inside a functioning experiment they didn't understand. Miller attempted to use his portable radio to contact the base camp, but the device produced only a high-pitched harmonic whine. The station was a closed loop, an island of organized reality that had severed its connection to the outside world. They returned to the surface, resealing the hatch with a sense of mounting urgency, only to find the main room changed. The tea in the cups was gone, replaced by fresh, steaming liquid, and the biscuits had been replenished on the ceramic plate. The clock on the wall had stopped, its pendulum frozen at the apex of its swing, yet the mechanical ticking continued to echo from the speakers. Thorn checked the perimeter once more, the gray light of midday providing no comfort against the isolation of the tundra. Their tracked vehicles sat exactly where they had left them, but the windshields were covered in a layer of frost that had formed into intricate geometric patterns. There were still no footprints, yet the sense of being watched had grown from a subtle prickle to an overwhelming, suffocating presence. The afternoon was spent in a desperate search for any clue that would explain the purpose of the orientation being corrected. They tore away the wall panels, finding only more of the strange, conduit-free wiring and a layer of lead shielding. Behind a false back in the supply closet, they discovered a collection of photographs, each one depicting the same stretch of empty tundra from different decades. The photos dated back to the 1920s, showing the gradual appearance of the rock outcrop where the station now sat, as if the land itself were growing. In the earliest images, there was nothing but a flat plain of snow, but by the 1950s, the gray concrete of the bunker had begun to emerge from the earth like a rising tide. The station hadn't been built. It had been revealed. As the second sunset approached, the radio transmissions shifted once more, the breathing becoming faster and more erratic. It was no longer the sound of someone waiting, but the sound of someone running, their gasps punctuated by the crunch of gravel and the clatter of metal. Despite the sound, the view through the station's windows showed only the still, silent fog and the unmoving trees. Thorn gathered the men in the center of the room, their weapons drawn but with no target to aim at. The ticking sound grew louder, vibrating through the console began to pulse in rhythm with the frantic breathing on the radio, concentric circles. Casting long, rhythmic shadows that stretched independently of the turned to a blinding, steady
Thorn
white,
ordered the team
illuminating
to gather
the
their gear.
redacted pages
The decision
of the
to
logbook
abandon the
until
post
the
coming
bleached
from a
paper
sudden,
seemed to chilling realization that the station's, quote, orientation was no longer aligned with the world they knew. As they retreated toward the exit, the heavy steel door resisted as if held by a vacuum, requiring their collective strength to force it open against a sudden howling pressure. Outside, the landscape had been transformed into a monochromatic void where the fog and snow merged into a single featureless gray. Their tracked vehicles were mere silhouettes in the gloom, and as they scrambled inside, the radio units erupted into a chorus of overlapping signals. Not voices, but the sound of thousands of mechanical clocks, all ticking at slightly different intervals. Looking back one last time, Thorn saw the observation post's yellow light flicker and die, the concrete structure appearing to settle deeper into the rock. The descent from the outcrop was a blur of vibrating instruments and disorientation, the compasses spinning uselessly as they broke through the fog line. By the time the scouting party reached the edge of the restricted zone, the signals had vanished, replaced by the familiar, comforting hiss of natural atmospheric static. They sat in the idling vehicles for a long time, watching the tree line, waiting for a pursuit that never came from a station that officially did not exist. Upon their return to headquarters, they found that their mission, which had felt like an arduous 3-day ordeal, had lasted only 6 hours, according to every official chronometer. The coordinates they provided were immediately flagged, and within 48 hours, the entire sector was reclassified as a high-altitude bombing range. This effectively scrubbed the 38th parallel from any future civilian or military mapping, burying the incident under layers of administrative static. The final report submitted by Captain Thorn was quietly filed away in a basement archive, its pages marked with the same heavy redactions he had seen in that silent bunker. No further signals were ever detected from the coordinate, and the bankrupt distributor of the supplies remains a ghost in corporate history, leaving no trail of how the station was actually stocked. It remains a vacuum in the records, a place defined only by what was missing. To this day, the few who have seen the declassified logs wonder if the correction mentioned in the journal was a success, or if the station is still out there, ticking away in a reality just a few degrees out of sync with our own. The truth of the 38th parallel is not a ghost story, but a cartographic error that the world simply decided to ignore. There are gaps in our history where the evidence simply stops, leaving us to stare into the silence of a redacted page. Some trails do not end. They simply lead to a place where the records were never meant to follow.